Hello there again, welcome to the second Devlog video of my survival game, Ment. Now if you haven't watched the first video or you aren't familiar with the game at all, Ment is a post-apocalyptic survival game with isometric pixelated retro style, with survival mechanics such as combat, resource management, and dynamic interactions, with a rich story about a classy steampunk world taken over by a parasitic illness. In the first video, I explained the whole concept and showed the progress for the basic graphic with point-and-click gameplay, followed by other features such as inventory system and so on. Now it's been quite a while since I made that video, and since then I made and refined a lot of things. One of them to be included, the combat system, which I promised in the last video to make a video about. I'm working on a unique combat mechanics that might involve dodges, counters, and melee attacks. It's still coming together, but the idea to make it feel as tense and unpredictable as the world itself. Combat's definitely going to get its own video devlog once I've nailed it down. So yeah, we're gonna cover that today, of how I designed the combat flow, enemies and weapons and their stats and anything between. Now it's more like a devlog, but I will try to put some tips whatsoever in case you will find it useful. I'm not a professional game designer, but with years of developing games and publishing a game on Steam, I can say I have a tiny bit of authority to give some hints. Without any further ado, let's get right into it. So the first thing I did was kind of take a look at what genre am I working in and the roots of the game, both storylines and graphics and other gameplay features. You need to answer two important questions to yourself in order to even start the combat system design. Why do we need to fight? Now, this question massively impacts how complicated and fun to play the combat is going to be, but let me give you a little example. Imagine a first-person shooter that is designed for you to kill enemies and process the game narratives. You mostly play with this specific mechanic of killing the enemies. It is designed to keep you entertained and to be fun to play. Doom Eternal, for example. You never get tired of killing enemies and get challenged to use your maximum potential to win the game. Now imagine a survival game like Resident Evil series. Sure, they don't give the greatest mobility or the smartest enemies to fight or even the funnest guns to use, because it is not meant to be satisfying. In this game, you mean to kill as many as you can and abandon them to complete the other important parts, such as puzzle and the other stuff. You see, it's all about why we're putting the enemies in the game in the first place. If you're designing a game that is meant to be all around killing enemies, you have to put enough effort in order to make it satisfying. But if your enemies are gonna be just annoying and more of a threat rather than a target, you're not obligated to make it fun, but more likely functional and balanced. What I did for my game is that to make the enemies appear as targets before you face a huge group of them and they turn into a deadly threats. For this, I needed to have enough difficulty that makes it harder to kill enemies the more they are. And the plan was to make good visual effects in order to make the combat satisfying. Now that I know why I'm adding enemies to the gameplay cycle, time for the next important question. What weapon do I use? Now you may think this is not a very important topic to discuss as your first steps toward designing a good combat, but hear me out. The variety of weapons in the games are limitless, from a sniper that can shoot the other side of the map to bare hands. Now, how can this be important as a core of our game? Well, the type of weapons that you give the player is going to be chained to a few factors of gameplay. For example, in a game that is designed with high mobility and a range of areas to run and do stuff in, you're not gonna give the player something like a slow, resource-limited pistol with a range limited and low accuracy. On the other hand, if you have a game that is all about someone exploring a dark hallway and the flashlight only shows a meter in front of his foot, you're not gonna equip him with a sniper. That's how limiting the range of the weapons you're giving the player is going to be important, in my opinion. For the Ment, I wanted to use both melee and guns, along together to create a dynamic flow that isn't too slow and skill-based, but isn't also that much fast and tension-based. Now that I know why I'm putting the combat in my game, and I know what type of weapon I want to use, time to actually take a step further and start designing. So you already know your weapons, but how are you gonna work with them? Some games like strategies rely on a slow pace and intelligence-based dynamic, making you put more thinking into the work, while fast-paced shooters force you to rely on your skills. Souls-like games test your timing and skills to fight, while many slashers just try to make it satisfying to play. There are millions of ways to control your attacks. Some games use auto-aiming while some force you to aim better. Some use simple controls while some give you a variety of keys on your keyboard to use. It's just a lot of ways. But let's see how I did this process for my own game. When I first prototyped the combat mechanics, you could aim with right click and shoot with left click, pretty standard. While your melee was a right click and you couldn't aim with it, just the position you're in. Now it had two major problems. First, due to the game being controlled by mouse click and point and click mechanics, it was pretty damn hard to position yourself correctly to land the melee attack. And next up was the problem of the melee being the same as aiming, and the shooting being the same as walking. Kinda made it pretty hard to handle whenever you wanted to aim or smash enemies. Here's however how I fixed it. First, I changed the melee from the right click to the middle scroll click, and could be only used when you're in the aiming mode. Kinda making sure that you have both gun and melee in the hand ready to use on the targets you're aiming at. But for the mobility, well, hear me out. You can walk with keyboard keys whenever you are in the aiming mode, which isn't actually accessible because, well, you walk with the mouse clicks on the normal mode. Sounds confusing enough, but you're already using that keys to move the camera whenever you're not aiming, so it's not like you are not working with them at all. I know it seems off, but very intuitive once you learn. And next up, the symbol toggle system to arm and disarm yourself with tap, making sure you won't shoot enemies in the middle of gathering items and talking to people. This part is kinda the most important since your pacing of your game is kinda attached to how you can fight, and that is itself attached to your camera view, graphics, and yeah, it's a painful chain. Now that we know we have a good functional system to attack, time to test it out with some enemies. So we got a fully functional character that can attack, and we know all the fundamental information for further steps. Time to go and make some enemies. Now for my game, if you don't know, enemies are mostly infected mutants, which are kinda equivalent to the classic zombies. The whole story goes around a really deadly illness with unknown origin, taking over the world, and whoever gets infected, they are doomed. Now I made a video before explaining the logic behind this illness, but long story short, this is how it works. After getting infected, illness starts to build a parasite inside your nerve system, while consuming your flesh within you to feed the parasite, slowly driving you crazy during the first week. After the process is finished and the parasite takes over the body, it starts to regenerate the host with random organs and limbs, slowly turning them into horrific creatures. So the older parasite lives within them, the bigger and less humanoid they become. Despite the story aspect, it's a good step to understand how I want my enemies to function and behave. Now I start with the first stage of enemies, the infected during the first week. This should resemble the classic zombies. They wait till you get close, they'll chase you, and once you're within the range, they will attack you. A little pause, and they will repeat the process, till you eventually kill them. And since these are the most common and the first type of enemies we encounter, they should be weak and slow. Again, it's so important how you design these enemies and their roles to match all the abilities of your combat. Remember, no one will use a mechanic often unless they are forced to. While designing enemies, it's good to know what part of player's skill tree we want to challenge. For example, my character can walk, run with limited stamina, shoot and attack with melee. He can't dash or roll, or neither can he dodge. The only way is to keep the distance and attack before the enemy can do. With this being said, we want to arrange the enemies in a way to follow up the character, give them a time to react and position themselves for the attack and defending. Since these first stages are very slow, the phasing mode alone is where you have to plan your next move, especially if there are more than one. Next stage mutants are kinda different. They are fast, about the same speed as you're running, which is horrific. They attack from a longer range and deal more damage, but they take longer to recover. Now the strategy to take them down changes a little. You either outrun or stun them during the chasing, or finish them with a good aim. less time to react when they are recovering from their last strike, giving you proper time to see what you're doing. As you can see, both of them, with similar functionality, challenge the player into different playing styles, because it checks all the standards of our character combat mechanic. Till now, we designed mostly all we needed for a good combat system. Now we've got all the enemies sorted out, time to get back to the weapons a bit and talk about your stats and how you make a difference between your weapons in terms of functionality. Now, I don't have much experience with this specific field, but I know one thing. It's not a matter of what properties or measurements you use. It's the matter of how you use them to create balance between your weapons. So in the first half of video, I said the main character carries 1 melee and a gun. And I explained how you can use them in order to attack enemies. So let's talk about what properties each one of these weapons include. First of the list, firearms. They have properties like force, kickback, which determines how much they push the enemies back, and discharge, which is basically how fast you can shoot after it's shot, like fire rate, if that makes sense. Then there's bullet type, ranging from type 1 to type 5. It's pretty straightforward, like you wouldn't expect a shotgun and a pistol to use the same ammo. Each bullet type also has a damage value, which type 1 being the weakest, and type 5 being the best, and the rarest to find and buy. Then we got melee weapons, basically anything you can smash enemies with. They got properties like force, kickback, and balance, which is like the range and how far you can dash toward enemies. We have bladed weapons like knives, swords, and anything that's sharp. This works the same as melees, but instead of kickback, they have a stun amount, which lets you anticipate enemies for a while. And finally, we have launchers. They're basically firearms, but with limited range. Their ammo type determines whether they get a stun or kickback, and there is some custom stuff in there, meaning they will rely more on ammo they use. Anything like crossbows or handmade guns that use something specific to work, I don't know, like nail guns. Now I know this may change as I keep developing, but for now it works pretty well. And that's pretty much all you need to know about combat system, as far as my knowledge extends. But I will give you some bonus tips and trips I use myself to make the combat more dynamic and satisfying. Let's talk about aiming. It's an isometric game, so aiming is a little bit tricky if you want something dynamic and slightly fast. There are a few techniques I see similar games do. Take Signalis for example, awesome game by the way. It uses a lock-on mechanic, making sure you won't miss your bullets, but I wanted something more manual. Then we have Project Zomboid that uses a basic crosser, which works but feels too static for me, so I combined a few tricks. Trick number 1. The crosser turns red when the target is in the line of fire, which all the games use I think. Like you may aim on something and then there is a wall slightly between you two stops the bullet, which happened a million times during the test, so yeah, very basic, very useful. Trick number 2. Laser pointer, which is also a command and used for the same issue. It just shows the direction and if it hits something you will notice. Trick number 3. Using a small indicator in the middle of crosser, which will be positioned where your bullets will hit, not where your cursor goes. In the perfect condition, both should be in the same place. Now for the game feel and extra satisfaction, I add a simple impact frame whenever you kill an enemy and some extra camera shakes, some blood particles, and some crunchy sound effects. And that's really all I had to say. Hope you enjoyed this video enough to like and subscribe. If you'd like to see more small news about the game, make sure to join my Telegram channel, and that's it. I don't know how to wrap up my videos, so...